Savith registered this fact the way she registered atmosphere pressure, as data, neutral filed. The processing bay of the ordained det was loud with the sounds of 400 colonists being sorted into labor grades, and in the noise, and the heat, and the smell of Scarith processing fluid, a single human in battered EVA armor wasn't, by any reasonable metric, significant. Except that the TBH human was looking directly at her. Savitha's chromatophores well, the heat-sensitive pigment cells that ran in band from her jaw to her dorsal ridge, shifted. Pale gold. Confusion response. She noted basically this clinically and did not allow it to spread below the collar line. The human's armor was old. Now, I mean antique. Old in the way that meant used constantly, without ceremonial pause. The chest plate had been patched with mismatched composite, 3 distinct colors of repair compound layered over what had once been standard issue, colony defense plating. The helmet visor well was cracked down the right side, and through the crack Savith could see that the human was a woman, jaw set, eyes moving with the particular economy of someone conducting a threat assessment in real time. One hand rested near, but not on her sidearm. The other was, in my opinion, already reaching toward the processing queue's perimeter barrier. Savith had been standing in the queue for 6 hours. Her wrists bore the Scarith intake tag, a clip of pale metal with her catalog number pressed into it in their angular script. Processing Unit 7204. She had spent the first hour calculating the legal avenues still available to the colonists, the second through 5th hours acknowledging that none of them led anywhere, and the 6th hour doing nothing at all, which was its own kind of conclusion. The human broke through the perimeter barrier at the 3rd post. Not explosively, not in the way the security feeds would later describe as a breach. She simply walked through the gap between 2 Scarith monitoring drones as they completed their rotation, slid under the beam sensor with the ease of someone who had counted the rotation interval several times before arriving, and was inside the queue before the nearest processing unit registered the incursion. Pretty much, Savith watched this. The human crossed 17 meters of processing floor. She moved between the colonists with minimal contact, a hand on one shoulder to redirect, a step sideways, a dip under an outstretched limb. Pretty much, she wasn't running. She was walking with the specific velocity of someone who had decided that the outcome was already determined and was simply closing the distance to it. She stopped in front of Savith. "I know you," she said. Savith's heat pits, the infrared sensory organs set in shallow grooves above her jaw, read the human's thermal signature. Boost core temperature, consistent with extended physical exertion. A thermal, I think, irregularity at the left shoulder, too localized for exertion. A wound, recent, still hot with inflammation. The human's surface temperature was otherwise even. Plus, she wasn't in a panic state. She was calm in the way that Savith had come to understand from long study of human behavioral literature, wasn't the same as relaxed. "I don't know you," Savith said. "That's fine." The human glanced left, and a Scarith enforcement unit was beginning its rotation back toward their section. 4-limbed, carapaced, carrying a shock prod that Savith's reference files classified as capable of inducing neural cascade in Shelvari physiology within 0.3 seconds of contact. "We're leaving. Stay close. I'm a cataloged unit of the Scarith reclamation proceeding. Leaving constitutes illegal, yeah." The human's hand found Savith's wrist, not grabbing, just a contact point, a direction. "Let's pretty much go." The Scarith drone completed its rotation. The human moved. Savitha's chromatophores went pale gold from jaw to dorsal ridge. She filed this as anomalous behavioral input, category unknown. Response: follow. She followed. The processing bay well had 17 active monitoring stations, 2 enforcement sweeps running on staggered 30-second intervals, and a perimeter hardened against unauthorized egress at every standard exit point. Savith knew this because she had spent 6 hours in the queue calculating the odds of exit, and the odds had not been good. The human appeared to know this also. She wasn't moving toward any of the standard exits. She was moving toward a thermal regulation access panel in the secondary wall. Savith noted this. She also noted that the panel had already been opened, The catch was already loose, the cover seated at a fractionally wrong angle that only registered if you were looking for it, which no Scarith enforcement unit would be, because the Scarith, in Savith's professional assessment, were thorough, but not imaginative. The human had been here before, or had accessed the station's construction schematics, which were theoretically proprietary, and had arrived having already done the work. Both possibilities were relevant. Neither was the most immediate concern. The most immediate concern was the enforcement unit that had deviated from its sweep pattern. Anomalous, perhaps a sensor ping, perhaps coincidence, and was now oriented 22 degrees toward their position. Savith opened her mouth to calculate their remaining seconds. The enforcement unit fired, plus not at them, at a position 2 degrees to their left. The shot was a proximity warning, Scarith procedure for detected unauthorized movement, and it hit a colonist standing at the edge of the queue, a Dravani trader who went down with a sound Savith's auditory processing cataloged, and then declined to dwell on. The human's direction did not change. The human's pace did not change. And the 0.4 seconds that Savith spent processing the discrepancy between this is the moment to recalculate survival probability. This human hasn't recalculated anything. The human reached the thermal panel, popped the cover with 2 fingers, and was through. For what it's worth, Savith followed. There was a moment. She would return to it later, turn in her memory the way her species turned smooth objects, reading heat through touch. There was a moment just inside the panel, in the dark of the access shaft, where the human pressed her back to the wall and held very still. The enforcement unit's thermal signature passed 6 centimeters from the panel edge. The hum of its scanning array moved through the wall and into Savith's heat pits as a vibration, a presence, a held breath that wasn't held by either of them but felt that way. The scan passed. The human let out a breath, which not relief. It had the texture of a system check, the exhalation of someone confirming that the numbers had come back as expected. TBH, you're bleeding, Savith said. Yep. The human's left shoulder under the armor. The heat signature had grown. The wound wasn't life-threatening at current rate of loss, but it was present, and it was fresh, and it had been fresh when the human had entered the processing bay, which meant she had arrived wounded, and had not considered this a variable worth adjusting before proceeding. Savith's chromatophores had gone a deep, troubled ochre. In the dark of the maintenance shaft, lit only by the faint bioluminescence of her own stress response, she looked at the intake tag, clipped to her wrist. Processing Unit 7204. The Scarith script was angular and efficient, and it contained no ambiguity. The human was already moving down the shaft, pulling a small kit from her kit belt, apparently intending to address the wound while walking. I told you, Savith said, following. I don't know you. I know, the human said. Then right shaft, I think, goes left at the 3rd junction. The human glanced back. Stay close. Savith stayed close. The Velsha calculation, the precise measure of survival debt that every Shelvari internalized from early cognition, was running constantly in a background process of her mind. One life extracted from Scarith reclamation proceeding. The debt was significant. The debt was, by any standard Shelvari accounting, unpayable by Savith's current means. She would have to restructure. The number kept coming out wrong, which not wrong as in incorrect. Wrong as in, the human had taken a hit on the way through the queue. A glancing shot, deflected by the armor's reactive coating, but a hit. Savith had the thermal imaging. To be fair, the impact had registered. The human had not slowed. The human had not repositioned to reduce exposure. The human had, as far as Savith's record showed, simply not registered the shot as a reason to change course. The Velsha calculation required a ledger. The ledger required that both parties understood the terms. Savith did not think the human understood there were terms. She filed this in the category she had been using. Since the moment the human stepped through the perimeter and looked at her directly across 17 meters of processing floor chaos. Category, unknown. She had, never needed that category before. She was still bleeding. Savith cataloged this from her position 3 body lengths back in the maintenance shaft, The thermal irregularity at the human's shoulder had not diminished. The armor's inner layer was doing partial compression work, but the wound was still losing heat at a rate inconsistent with clotting. The human had not stopped. The human had, in fact, produced a field dressing from the kit at her belt and was applying it to her own shoulder while navigating a junction. Left hand doing the wound work, right hand on the shaft wall for orientation, head turning at the junction point to confirm the path before committing. Savith watched this, which in Shelvari field medicine, a wound of that temperature and apparent depth required cessation of physical exertion for a minimum of 4 minutes to allow pressure stabilization. This wasn't a preference. It was, physiology. Savith had the medical files. She was a diplomatic analyst by training, which meant her reference library was complete, which meant she knew that human physiology had a notably higher pain threshold than Shelvari physiology, but that this wasn't infinite, and that a wound actively losing thermal mass while its host continued strenuous physical activity was the human bit the end of the field dressing off with her teeth to free both hands. Savith's heat pits registered the temperature in the shaft, 4.2 degrees above standard station ambient, consistent with thermal regulation function. The look, walls hummed, and distant, very distant, 6 levels up, she could hear the oscillating pitch of a Scarith sweep sensor cycling through its range. They had perhaps 11 minutes before this section of the thermal grid cycled into active diagnostic, and their heat signatures would register on the grid's maintenance map. The sweep cycle for this grid section completes in 11 minutes, Savith said. 10, the human said. I counted on the way in. She had counted on the way in. She had already been in this shaft. Savith filed this. She filed the field dressing, now neatly secured. She filed the fact that the human had applied the dressing without looking at it, by feel alone, while moving. She filed the way the human moved, economical, unhurried in a specific way that wasn't slowness, but efficiency, each motion completing before the next began. In the Shelvari Diplomatic Corps, there was a classification system for alien species behavioral profiles. Savith had contributed basically to 3 of the existing entries. The human species TBH, Homo sapiens, was classified under behavioral subcategory 7. High variance, low predictability, contingency response dominant. This meant that humans, when observed across population-level data, showed an unusually wide spread of individual behavioral responses to identical stimuli. It was diplomatically a polite way of noting that humans were difficult to model. Savith was beginning to understand that the classification had been written by people who had not spent time in a maintenance shaft with one. The human stopped, settled for what it's worth back against the wall, and opened a ration pack from the second pocket of her kit belt. The ration pack, Savith's chemical sensors registered this immediately, contained capsaicin compounds at a concentration that, in Shelvari physiology, would trigger a pain response in the mucous membrane sufficient to require medical intervention. The human was eating it with the focused, satisfied attention of someone consuming something they had been looking forward to. You're consuming a neurotoxin, Savith said. Jerky, the human said. Want some? That compound, it's spicy. It's good. The human looked at her. The visor crack ran down the right side of the helmet face, and through it Savith could see the human's eye, dark, steady, the kind of steady that wasn't emptiness but attention. You okay? And you're doing the color thing. Savith became aware that her chromatophores were reading deep ochre along the full visible band. I'm processing, she said. Okay. The human ate the jerky. She was humming, not loudly, a low, rhythmic sound that had no apparent communicative function. Savith identified it as a human vocalization pattern associated with. She checked her reference files, contentment. TBH, task focus. Self-soothing under stress. The literature was contradictory on which applied in field conditions. The human organized her kit by touch. Without looking, each component returned to its assigned position with the ease of 10,000 repetitions. Wound kit. Breech charges, 2 of them, small, the kind used for controlled structural entry. A scanner, and something that Savith identified as a human tool for forcing mechanical locks. worn smooth at the handle. One spare ration pack. The human finished her own pack, folded the wrapper with habitual precision, and tucked it into the kit. Then, without announcement, she held out the spare. Savith looked at it. The Velsha calculation ran. Adding a ration pack to an already incalculable debt was a fractional concern. That wasn't why Savith looked at it for longer than the situation required. She looked at it because the human had not offered it as transaction. There had been no calculation visible in the gesture. No, you'll owe me. No, this earns me something. The hand had extended and the pack had been in it, and the human had looked back at the junction they'd come from, already monitoring the shaft, already doing the next thing, as if the offer were so minor it didn't require her attention to complete. Savith's species had a word, Velsha, for the precise weight of a survival debt. They had 17 words for different categories of obligation. They had compound words for debts that couldn't be repaid in kind and must be restructured into service, into future consideration, into formal acknowledgement. They did not have a word for this. Savith took the pack, and the human nodded once. Not in acknowledgement of a transaction. Not in the way you nodded when a deal was struck. In the way you nodded when something small had been handled correctly, and you could both move on. Savith opened the pack. It contained a caloric mixture her species could metabolize. The temperature of look it in her hands registered as exactly 37.2 degrees Celsius, body temperature. The human, I think, had been carrying it against her side. She did not mention this. The human was already consulting the small scanner, its readout casting a pale glow in the shaft. Her fingers, Savith noticed this, and then noticed herself noticing it, and couldn't stop. Her fingers were wrapped. Old tape, re-wrapped over older tape, and beneath both layers the evidence of scar tissue at the knuckles, two of them healed at a slight angle. The kind of healing that happened in the field, without setting, without proper care. The kind of healing that meant she had been in places where the alternative to imperfect healing was no healing at all. Three kind of knuckles on, the right hand taped, one on the left, and the tape on the left was newer. Savith ate the ration pack. In 11 minutes, in 10, now, the thermal sweep would cycle. They would need to move. She began recalculating exit routes. Savith asked the wrong question. She had been constructing the right question for 34 minutes, calibrating it, checking it against the available data, rejecting early drafts as imprecise, and then, in the dim heat of the shaft with the distant Scarith sweeps cycling above and below them, and the human reviewing the extracted station schematics on her scanner with the focused patience of someone doing a task that was simply the next task, Savith asked the wrong one. Why did you return for me? She had meant to ask how. How had the human known her location? How had she accessed the intake manifests? How had she arrived on a Scarith reclamation vessel in the first place? Given that the ordained debt was a protected class asset under the hegemonic creditor accords, which technically granted its crew and passengers the legal status of private property in transit, which meant boarding without documentation was an act of, you were cold, the human said. She did not look up from the scanner. Pretty much, Savith's chromatophores went pale. Not gold in my opinion. Pale, which the response below pale gold was a thing she had not experienced since early cognition training, when the instructors ran scenarios designed to locate the boundaries of a diplomat's composure. I was cold, Savith repeated. Plus, in the field camp. Sort of 6 years ago. The Vithian evacuation. The human turned the scanner, checked a junction marker, turned it back. You were in the non-priority section. The medics weren't going to get to you before dark. You were a pause, not for emotional effect, just for memory retrieval. Cold. Plus, I had a blanket. The shaft wall had weld seams at regular intervals. Savith could see 5 of them from her current position. She counted them, then counted again. I don't remember this, she said. You were unconscious. Then, how do you were listed in the triage log. Chedvari fait mal, diplomatique corps identification, non priorité. Plus, I looked you up after. The human's thumb moved across the scanner. Took a while to find a picture. Plus, your species pretty much all look similar to me. The corner of her mouth, visible through the visor crack, shifted. No offense. None, Savith stopped. She was a diplomatic analyst. She had 17 years of field experience reading conversational subtext across 43 species. She had sat at tables where the wrong inference could unseat a government. She was, by professional assessment, the most precise interpreter of intent in the Shelvari Corps, second only to senior analyst Vethera, who was 8 years her senior and had 4 more limbs. She couldn't find a right category for what the human was describing. Shelvari did not have a concept for this. For someone who encountered a stranger in distress, provided care, and then maintained the bond in the absence of the other party's knowledge. Velsha required mutual awareness. Obligation flowed between parties who both understood the terms. You couldn't accrue a debt to someone who did not know they were owed. Except that, apparently, you could. Except that, apparently, a human could decide, alone, unwitnessed, without informing the other party, that a connection existed, and then maintain it. For 6 years, until it was necessary. The weld seam near Savitha's left hand had a small imperfection. A bubble in the seal material, raised 0.3 millimeters above the surrounding surface. She pressed her finger against it. Actually cool. Smooth except to be fair, for that one point. You found my location in the Scarith intake manifests, she said. Had a contact pull them. And then you came here. Savith kept her finger on the imperfection. To, I guess, a Scarith reclamation vessel. Alone. Brought breach charges. Alone. The human looked up from the scanner for the first time in several minutes. Her expression, Savith was moderately skilled at human facial expression, a source of professional pride, was neutral. Not cold, not warm. Something underneath both. The expression, of someone who had not considered that there was an alternate version of events in which they did not come. You were in trouble, she said. This was, apparently, the complete sentence. Savith removed her finger from the weld imperfection. She was aware, with a precision she couldn't prevent, couldn't redirect, couldn't file into any category that held it adequately, that her chromatophores had stopped. They did not stop. Under, I guess, any standard conditions, they did not stop. The thermoreactive cells maintained their readout constantly. It was involuntary, like a heart rate, like the chemical response of the scent glands. Her species did not control their chromatophores any more than they controlled their body temperature. They had stopped. TBH, Savith noted this. She noted it with the part of her mind that continued functioning at clinical capacity, the part that had file processing unit 7204, and sweep intervals, and thermal gradients, and the composition of human field rations. She filed it under the category she had opened in the processing bay. Unknown. In Shelvari, there were 23 compound words for types of obligation and their resolution. There were 9 words for gratitude alone, classified by the degree of debt carried and the formality of acknowledgement required. Savith had used all of them in professional context. She had kind of never encountered a gap. I don't have a word for this, she said. It wasn't the response she had prepared. It sort of was, however, the correct one. The human looked at her for a moment. Then, back at the scanner, which okay, she said. Outside, above them, the Scarith sweep completed its cycle and began again. The Scarith found them. Not through the honestly thermal grid. Savith had been tracking the cycle, and they had cleared the diagnostic window by 4 minutes. Not through the breach charges the human had used at the first junction, which had been careful work, small, and precise. They had been found because the colonist intake manifests, when cross-referenced against the labor pool audit the Scarith ran every 9 hours, had produced a discrepancy. One Shelvari unit, cataloged at 1,800 hours, absent from the audit at 300 hours. 7 months of Scarith reclamation practice had made them meticulous with their accounting. The alert tone was specific. Savith had heard it twice in the past hours, both false positives from the intake cues, but this time it was followed by a second tone, lower, and she felt the human go still beside her in a way that was different from all the other times the human had gone still. They flagged you, the human said. Yes. How long before sweep teams reached this grid? Based on the pattern intervals, Savith ran the calculation. For minutes. Perhaps 3. The human's mouth went flat. Like not fear. Something more like a carpenter finding a measurement off. The ship's on the far side of the dock ring, she said. We need the maintenance transit corridor, Junction 7 to Junction 19, through the active processing section. That route passes 4 enforcement stations. 3. One's offline for calibration. I checked on the way in. The remaining 3 are between us. The airlock, yeah. The human was already moving. The scanner dark, everything stowed. So we move. The probability of Sabbath. The human looked back through the cracked visor. Plus, I honestly filed the legal challenge with the Hegemonic Review Board before I came aboard. Reclamation proceedings against diplomatic corps personnel are challengeable under the 7th Accords. It'll take time, but it's filed. The colony's case is on record. The paperwork's moving. Sabbath processed this. The human had filed the legal challenge first, before boarding, before any of this. The paperwork was already moving through the review board at this moment while they were in a maintenance shaft with 3 enforcement stations between them and the airlock, and the human had come in anyway. For what it's worth, had filed the papers, and then come in anyway. Plus, why, Sabbath said, did you not simply wait for the review process? That takes 18 months. And so I came and got you. The human's voice was even. Junction 7. Let's go. Sabbath's chromatophores have been cycling through 3 colors for the last 30 seconds, and she had not noticed until now. Pale gold, deep ochre, back to pale gold. Confusion, alarm, confusion. Plus, the cycle of an analytic system encountering a persistent error in its foundational model. She moved. The maintenance shaft opened into the transit corridor at Junction 7, and the transit corridor was loud and bright with the blue-white glow of Scarith. Processing lights, functional, unadorned, the aesthetic of a species that had not evolved beauty as a survival-relevant trait, and had not subsequently developed it. The human moved into the corridor without pause, staying close to the wall, and Sabbath followed. First enforcement station, 30 meters ahead, 1 unit, running intake verification on a group of colonists. The human watched it for 4 seconds, identified the gap in its attention window. The unit's optical sensors were focused on the document processing task, and crossed the open section. Sabbath crossed, and second station. They went around it through a secondary storage passage that the human located on the schematics in less than 2 seconds of scanner consultation. The passage smelled of Scarith preservative fluid, which Sabbath's chemical sensors cataloged as strongly aversive and which the human apparently did not notice. Third station, between them and the airlock and 40 meters of open corridor. No cover. The enforcement unit's scan range was comprehensive. The human stopped, looked at the corridor, looked at the unit. Sabbath ran the calculation. Every route she could model from their current position ended at this station. There was no alternate path that reached the airlock without passing within the unit's detection range. The probability to be fair of the human straightened, put her scanner away, plus walked into the corridor, not sneaking, not running, walking, with the specific weight and direction of someone who was authorized to be there, who had authorization. That simply had not been communicated yet, who was on their way to somewhere, and the corridor was incidental. The enforcement kind of unit registered her, which the human kept walking, its optical array oriented toward her. The scan range, Sabbath was tracking this from the junction. One hand on the wall, her chromatophores gone very still, the scan range activated. The unit produced the standard Scarith challenge tone. The human stopped and turned, reached into the kit at her belt. She produced documentation. Sabbatha's diplomatic analyst mind noted several things simultaneously. The documentation was paper format, which Scarith systems couldn't scan wirelessly and therefore required manual verification, which took time. The human had timed her approach for the gap between this unit's reporting cycles. And the documentation, Sabbath could read the header from 30 meters, her long-range optical processing with a Shell-Vari biological advantage. The documentation appeared to be an access authorization from the Hegemonic Review Board, which the human had said was where she had filed the legal challenge this morning, which meant she had printed the filing confirmation and was presenting it as if it constituted an access order, which it did not. which the Scarith unit would determine in approximately 90 seconds of manual verification. But in those 90 seconds, the human turned very slightly, a position adjustment, apparently, and looked directly at Savith with the single focused message of now. Savith had never moved that fast in her life. The airlock was 43 meters from the enforcement station. The human reached it in 11 seconds, Savith in 12. The human's hands were on the cycle controls before Savith cleared the frame, and the inner door was sealed in the 4 seconds it took the enforcement unit to process that the documentation it was reviewing was, in fact, not a valid access order. The outer door cycled, which the docking bridge connected. Savith heard the Scarith alert tone change pitch, not the audit tone, the enforcement breach tone now, as the inner airlock door sealed behind them. She heard the human, in the narrow space of the docking bridge, exhale. Not relief. The same system check exhalation as in the shaft after the first patrol passed. The I think sound of numbers confirming. Savith's chromatophores had gone copper red at some point in the past 43 meters. She noted this, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to care about note-taking. Her wrist was bare. She looked at it. The intake tag, processing unit 7204, was gone. She had not noticed when it was cut. At some point in the run, in the chaos of the transit corridor, in the 11 seconds between the airlock and the enforcement station, the human had done it. Her tool, kind of for mechanical locks, worn smooth at the handle, had passed Savith's wrist and moved on, and Savith had not noticed, because by that point there had been too many things to notice, too many things in the unknown category, and the human had not announced it, had not said, I'm removing this, or you're not a number, or any of the things at the moment, in retrospect, felt as if it should have contained. She had just cut it off, and kept moving. Savith stared at her wrist. The coupling bracket scarf on the clip was barely visible. 3 millimeters. She rubbed her thumb across it, and from the ship ahead, a light came on in the corridor. Warm, not blue-white, the color of something that had been chosen rather than optimized. The hatch at the far end of the bridge opened, and the ship smelled different from the station. Recycled air with particulate trace of human food preparation, something chemical from the engine housing, and underneath it all something organic and unclassifiable that Savith's reference files cataloged under human habitat, lived in with a confidence rating of 91%. In, the human said. Reeves had a plan. Savith, having now spent the better part of 9 hours observing Reeves's methods, suspected it wasn't a plan so much as a direction with an aggressive level of confidence attached to it. This wasn't a criticism, which it was she was discovering a distinction without much practical difference. The ship was small. A 2-crew configuration, I guess, rigged for single operation, which meant every surface had been reorganized to accommodate one person's reach radius. The cockpit was, Savith searched her vocabulary and settled on inhabited. There was a food wrapper tucked under one console, a small framed image attached to. The panel above the navigation array with what appeared to be adhesive compound, and a dent in the secondary console that was roughly fist-shaped and clearly not structural. The dent was on the right side of the console. Savith noted this without comment. Reeves took the pilot's seat and began cycling the undock sequence. Her hands, TBH, moved across the controls with the same automatic competence as they'd moved across the field kit in the shaft, the competence of not having to think about it, which meant thinking was available for other things. Scarith will file a pursuit order, Savith said. Filed a counter-injunction 20 minutes ago through the review board system. Automated. Should ping their pursuit coordinator before they finish authorization. Reeve checked a readout. Probably. Their legal system is thorough. Works in our favor. A sequence of lights on the navigation panel shifted from amber to green. Probably. The ship detached from the docking bridge. Through the forward viewport, the ordained deck filled the frame, vast, pale-hulled, geometric with the particular austerity of Scarith design. Nothing that did not serve a function. No curvature that wasn't load-bearing. The architecture of a species that had eliminated the concept of ornamentation entirely. Savith watched it recede. The colony, she said. Legal challenge covers the whole colony. All 400 sort of, and 12 of them. Reeves didn't look away from the navigation panel. The seventh, accords have been invoked before against reclamation proceedings. Precedent exists. It'll move. 18 months, you said. 16, probably. The board's been faster since the Yethvar case. Savith had worked on the Yethvar case. She had been the junior analyst who had found the procedural precedent that made the Seventh Accord's argument viable for non-signatory colonial settlements. She had filed it in the core archives 4 years ago and had not thought about it since. She thought about to be fair now. Your filing, she said. Which section of the Accords did you cite? Reeves glanced at the datapad clipped to the side console. Savith followed the glance. The datapad screen was partially visible, the filing header, and below it, the case reference number, review board case number, standard format, and alongside it, a small symbol. It wasn't a hegemonic symbol. It wasn't, I guess, a board classification. It was a small hand-drawn mark, the kind a human made as a personal notation, distinct from the standardized fields of the form. A cross like 4 equal arms, a center point. Savith looked at it. Her heat pits read the datapads. Surface temperature as ambient. Honestly, the mark was old. The ink had been compressed into the material, not recently applied. It had been there for years, whatever it meant. She did not ask. Section 12b, Reeves said, diplomatic corps affiliation as qualifying nexus for protected status extension to associated civilian populations. Savith's section. Her precedent. Her 4-year-old archive filing, which had apparently been read by a human bounty hunter who had then retained it for use in a legal challenge filed on behalf of a colony that included a Shelvari diplomatic analyst she had wrapped in a blanket 6 years ago in a field camp while she was unconscious. You knew the legal argument before you came, Savith said. Did the research? You did the research? Yeah. Reeves's attention was on a navigation flag that had appeared on the secondary display. Scareth query, possibly the pursuit authorization, responding exactly as Reeves had predicted. She began keying the counter-injunction response. Plus, you wrote the precedent. Made the argument clean. Savith looked at her wrist again. The coupling scar, was barely visible now. She pressed her thumb against it. Not to feel pain, there was very little. To feel the proof of its absence. Did you know my name? She said. When you came for me. Reeves's hands paused on the controls. A fraction TBH of a second only, and then she reached for the main intake log, a separate datapad, older, the material worn at the edges where it had been held thousands of times, and scrolled. For what it's worth, she stopped. Looked at the screen. I had you down as the cold one, she said. Savitha's chromatophores, she wasn't managing them. She had not been managing them for some time. They did whatever they did, and she noted it when she noticed it. They were, at this moment, a color she couldn't name from memory, somewhere between pale gold and something that wasn't in her standard response palette. She said, I wasn't conscious. No, you did not know my name. No, you had no means of verifying. That I would be on the ordained debt in particular. Had a probability assessment, based on your last known location and the Scareth Fleet movement pattern. Reeves set the counter-injunction running. Leaned back, looked at the viewport, where the ordained debt had receded to a pale rectangle against the curve of the colony planet. It was pretty solid. The colony planet turned below them. From this altitude, Savith could see the settlement grid, small, regular, the kind of careful geometry that represented not an architect's vision, but a community's accumulated decision-making. Fields, roads, a water processing installation. Someone had painted the roof of the processing installation a deep, impractical red. You were cold, Reeves said. I had to honestly blanket. She said it the same way she had said it in the shaft. The same register, which the same complete absence of inflation. And it meant, well, the same thing now that it had meant then, which was, this is the whole story. This is where it begins, and this is where it ends, and I don't know why you need more than this. Savith looked at the datapad with the small hand-drawn mark. She looked at, for what it's worth, her own wrist. She looked at the Scareth vessel, shrinking in the viewport. In Shelvari, there were 23 compound words for obligation, 9 words for gratitude, classified by debt weight, and required formality. The language was precise and complete, It had been refined over 4,000 years of diplomatic practice. Savith had used every word in it professionally and found none of them wanting. There was no word for what Reeves had done. There was no word for the thing that made a person wrap a stranger in a blanket, then spend 6 years carrying the memory, then file legal paperwork, then board a reclamation vessel alone, then cut a serial tag off a wrist in the middle of a run without mentioning it. There was no word for the thing that made the blanket and the paperwork and the running the same gesture. In Shelvari, there was no such word. Savith was a diplomatic analyst. She built frameworks. She found precedents. She constructed arguments from gaps in existing structures. She would have to build one. I'll now generate the image prompts file, prompts.txt, to 80-plus prompts in story order, 1 per scene. Prompts.txt, a vast interior processing bay aboard a Scarith reclamation vessel, lit by cold blue-white industrial lighting casting hard shadows across rows of catalog colonists from multiple species standing in orderly queues. The walls are angular and unornamented, pale gray composite plating with Scarith script stenciled at regular intervals. In the foreground, a serpentine alien female, Savith, a Shelvari, stands upright on a coiled lower body, approximately 2 meters tall, with iridescent scale plates running from jaw to dorsal ridge, currently shifting to a pale gold coloration, her heat pit sensory organs visible as shallow grooves above her jaw, wide dark eyes scanning the bay. She wears the torn remnants of a diplomatic corps uniform. A pale metal clip tag is fastened to her wrist. The atmosphere is tense and oppressive. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A wide well, shot of the processing bay interior showing hundreds of colonists of various species arranged in intake queues under the supervision of Scarith enforcement units. Four-limbed insectoid creatures with dark carapace plating, carrying shot prods that glow faintly at the tip. For what it's worth, ceiling is high and industrial, hung with scanning arrays and drone ports. Emergency lighting in blue-white casts everything in a cold, clinical hue. The scale of the operation is immense and dehumanizing. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A medium shot inside the Scarith processing bay. A human woman in battered EVA armor stands at the outer edge of the colonist queue, barely visible at the perimeter, her helmet visor cracked down the right side. The armor is old and heavily repaired, mismatched composite patches in 3 different colors overlaid on gray base plating. She's still, one hand near, but not on her sidearm, dark eyes through the visor scanning the room with calm precision. 2 Scarith monitoring drones hover in the middle distance. The lighting is cold blue-white. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the human woman's cracked helmet visor, lit from within by the cold blue-white of the processing bay. Through the crack, one dark eye is visible, focused, steady, conducting a threat assessment with the economy of long practice. The crack runs diagonally from the upper right of the visor, and light refracts strangely through it. The rest of the face is in shadow. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A Scarith monitoring drone in profile. Angular, 4-pronged, matte black carapace with a central optical array rotating on a silent mechanism. Blue scanning light pulses from the array's leading edge. In the blurred background, the colonist queue continues. The drone hovers at approximately chest height, its scanning sweep tracing a slow arc cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A wide shot. The human woman, Reeves, slides under a beam sensor between 2 Scarith monitoring drones, her body nearly horizontal for a fraction of a second, armor scraping nothing, timing the rotation gap with precise calculation. The drones continue their rotation unaware. The colonist queue in the background is still and orderly. The movement is almost invisible in the cold industrial light. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot from the Shelvari alien's perspective. The human woman, Reeves, walking directly toward her across 17 meters of processing floor. The human moves between colonists with minimal contact, A hand redirect here, a step aside there, not running, walking with velocity. Her cracked visor reflects the blue-white light, which around her the chaos of the processing bay continues, oblivious. The Shelvari's pale, gold chromatophore coloration is visible in the foreground as she watches. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close up on the Shelvari, female Sabbath's face and upper torso, her scale plates along the jaw. Dorsal ridge have shifted to a pale gold coloration, her confusion response. Her heat pit organs above the jaw are faintly active. Her wide, in my opinion, dark eyes are fixed on something off-frame. Her diplomatic core uniform is torn at the shoulder. The metal intake tag on her wrist reads scare script. Expression, in my opinion, is one of profound clinical processing, not fear but deep system disruption. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic, lighting, deep space setting. A close two-shot. The human Reeves stands directly in front of the Shelvari Sabbath, facing her. Reeves's cracked visor is level with Sabbath's upper chest, the human a lot shorter than the serpentine alien. Reeves's posture is matter-of-fact. Sabbath's chromatophores are pale gold. Between them, a distance of perhaps half a meter, intimate by alien processing bay standards. Reeves's mouth is just visible through the visor crack, open to speak. Cold blue-white light from above. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A Scarith enforcement unit in the middle distance, beginning to rotate on its patrol sweep. Four-limbed, dark carapaced. Its shock prod active with a faint blue glow at the tip. Its optical array has begun to orient toward the area where Reeves and Sabbath are standing. Other colonists in the queue appear unaware. The blue-white industrial light creates sharp shadows on the enforcement unit's angular carapace. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Action shot. Reeves in motion, her hand making brief contact with Sabbath's wrist. Not gripping, just a contact point of direction. Both of them already beginning to move through the colonist queue toward the far wall. Sabbath's larger, form is immediately behind Reeves, moving with the compliance of someone whose alternatives have just changed. The enforcement unit in the background has fully oriented toward their previous position. Cold industrial lighting, motion blur on, the figures. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A wide shot of the Scarith processing bay. In the background, an enforcement unit discharges its shock prod toward the edge of the colonist queue, a blue-white energy discharge, violent and sudden. A colonist, a Dravani trader with a broad flat body and iridescent blue-gray hide, collapses. The colonists nearest the discharge scatter or freeze. In the far background, barely visible, two small figures are moving toward a secondary wall panel. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot. Reeves's hands working a thermal regulation access panel in the secondary wall of the processing bay. The panel cover is already slightly ajar, the catch loose. Her fingers find the release with practiced ease. Behind her, Sabbath's large form blocks line of sight to the colonist queue. The panel opens onto darkness. Plus, the blue-white processing bay light illuminates the human's patched armor in sharp relief. Cinematic pretty much, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. An interior shot of a narrow maintenance shaft inside the Scarith vessel. Tight, utilitarian, walls of gray composite with weld seams at regular intervals, and thermal regulation conduit running along the ceiling. Emergency LED strips cast a pale amber light. In the shaft, Reeves presses her back against the wall, her cracked helmet just visible. Just inside the panel entry point, Sabbath's serpentine lower body is coiling to fit the confined space, her scale plates registering pale, gold ochre coloration. Cinematic to be fair, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close up on the shaft wall, Sabbath visible in profile. A Scarith enforcement unit's thermal scanning array passes along the exterior of the wall, its skin beam visible as a thin line of blue light at the panel edge. 6 centimeters. The beam moves steadily. Sabbath is for what it's worth. Heat pit organs are faintly luminous as they track the thermal signature through the wall. Her chromatophores are tightly held. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The shaft interior, ambient glow from Savatha's stress coloration illuminating a small area. Reeves is already pulling a field kit from her belt and moving down the shaft. Her left shoulder, visible under the armor's collar, shows a thermal irregularity, the warm, irregular signature of a fresh wound. She hasn't paused to address it. Savath watches from behind, her pale gold chromatophores casting faint light on the shaft walls. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves moving through the maintenance shaft, her left hand applying a field dressing to her own left shoulder one-handed, her right hand on the shaft wall for navigation. The motion is utterly practiced. She doesn't look at what her left hand is doing, her attention on the junction ahead. The field dressing tape is military gray. Behind her, barely in frame, the subtle glow of Savatha's chromatophores. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot inside the maintenance shaft. Reeves has stopped at a junction, back against the wall, one knee raised. She's opened a ration pack and is eating from it, dried meat, with focused satisfaction. Her helmet, for what it's worth, is still on, visor cracked. Savatha's upper body is visible behind her, significantly larger, scale plates at deep ochre, watching with the concentrated attention of someone cataloging an anomaly. The shaft lighting is amber LED strips. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves's hands in the maintenance shaft. Her fingers are wrapped in field tape. Old tape re-wrapped over older tape. Beneath both layers the evidence of knuckle scars, two on the right hand healed at slight angles, consistent with field injuries imperfectly set. Her hands move with automatic competence, returning the ration pack wrapper to the kit. The tape is, I guess, scuffed and reapplied. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot. Reeves holds out a second ration pack towards Savath in the dim maintenance shaft. She is sent looking at Savath. Her attention is back on the junction they came from, monitoring. The offer is casual, almost incidental, the pack simply in her extended hand. Savatha's form fills the background, chromatophores at deep ochre, her wide dark eyes on the offered pack. The amber LED light casts warm shadows on both figures. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Savatha's wrist and hand, her three-fingered Shelvari hand, scaled with elongated digits and small heat-sensing pits at the fingertips, reaches out and takes the ration pack from Reeves's extended hand. The contact is brief, deliberate. The metal intake tag with Scarith script is visible at her wrist. The shaft's amber light catches the iridescent edge of her scale plates. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Savatha's face in profile in the maintenance shaft. She holds the ration pack with both hands, looking at it. Her chromatophores have settled from ochre toward a muted, unnamed color, not in her standard response palette. Her expression is still, precise, inward. The ration pack is small against her large-scaled hands. Ambient-like, glow from her own bioluminescent stress response, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A quiet honestly, two-shot in the maintenance shaft. Reeves is consulting a small scanner, its readout casting pale blue light on her cracked visor. Savath is eating from the ration pack, coiled beside her. Neither is looking at the other, but the distance between them has decreased from earlier scenes. The amber LED light and the blue scanner glow mix in confined space. Above them, the faint oscillating pitch of a Scarith sweep sensor cycling through its range is suggested by a barely visible vibration line in the shaft ceiling. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the Scarith intake tag on Savatha's wrist. The pale metal clip catches the amber light. The Scarith script, angular, efficient. Reads processing unit 7204. Sabbath's scaled thumb presses against the edge of the tag. The shaft wall behind is gray composite with one weld seam visible. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Interior shot of the maintenance shaft. Reeves and Sabbath are moving again, Reeves leading, scanner dark, and stowed. The shaft narrows ahead at a junction. Reeves moves with the same unhurried velocity as before. Sabbath follows, kind of her larger form moving with surprising economy in the confined space. Her chromatophores are still at the unnamed muted color. The amber LED lighting creates a tunnel of warm light ahead of them. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Sabbath's face in the maintenance shaft. Her wide dark eyes aren't on the path ahead, but on the human moving in front of her. Her heat pits above the jaw glow faintly, reading the human's thermal signature. Her expression is one of profound, focused analysis, a creature using every sensory tool it possesses to understand something that resists understanding. Her chromatophores cycle slowly between pale gold and ochre. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot inside the maintenance shaft. Sabbath's right hand presses against the shaft wall, fingertip against a small imperfection in a weld seam. A raised bubble 0.3 millimeters above the surface. Her eyes are unfocused, turned inward. Reeves is sort of visible beyond her, checking a junction marker. The amber light catches the raised imperfection precisely. Sabbath's look, scale plates have gone still. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A close two-shot. Reeves and Sabbath face each other in the maintenance shaft, the human small against the serpentine alien. Reeves is looking at her scanner. Sabbath is looking at Reeves. The human's posture is closed, efficient, task-focused. Sabbath is, I think, open, oriented, the posture of someone whose entire being is directed at one object of attention. The shaft's amber light, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves's face through the cracked visor of her helmet. Expression neutral, not cold, not warm, something underneath both. The expression of someone who hasn't considered that there's an alternate version of events in which they did not come. One dark eye visible through the visor crack, level and certain. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot of the maintenance shaft. Both figures are still in a pocket of amber LED light. Sabbatha's chromatophores have stopped, their color fixed in an unnamed, anomalous hue. The bioluminescent stress response cells motionless. This is visually unusual. The cell should be cycling. Both figures are quiet, and the shaft above and below them recedes into darkness. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the weld seams in the maintenance shaft wall, Sabbath's scaled hand visible at the edge of frame, one fingertip resting on the raised imperfection of the near seam. The seams are regular, precise, scarith construction, plus 5 visible kind of in a row. The imperfection is subtle, but present. The amber light catches the texture of the wall. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves's old battered datapad. Clipped to the side console of her ship, the material worn at the edges with heavy use. The screen shows a filing header from the hegemonic review board. In the corner of the screen, a small hand-drawn mark is visible. A cross with 4 equal arms and a centered point pressed deep into the material, old, clearly not recent. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot inside the maintenance shaft. Sabbath presses her scaled thumb against the weld imperfection. Her eyes are unfocused. Her chromatophores are still. The amber light, though to be fair, shaft is very quiet except for the faint distant hum of the scarith vessel systems. Reeves is visible in the background, already consulting the scanner again. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Alert tone visual. Interior of the Scarith Processing Station Maintenance Network. Alarm indicators activate in sequence along the corridor ceiling, casting intermittent red light over the angular gray walls. Scarab scrolls on wall-mounted panels. The change in lighting shifts the corridor from amber-lit to crisis red. The angular scarab aesthetic is unchanged. No curves, no ornamentation, pure function now in alert mode. Cinematic sci-fi illustration. Honestly, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot inside the maintenance shaft. Reeves and Savith both alert. Reeves's posture has shifted from task focus to threat response, though the change is economical, minimal. Her hand is near the sidearm. Savitha's chromatophores have snapped to copper red, her alarm response, and her heat pits are fully active, scanning the walls. The ambient light has shifted as the station alert changes the corridor lighting outside the shaft. Cinematic kind of sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves's, to be fair, face through the cracked visor, now with the red alert light seeping through the shaft panel seams. Her expression shows the carpenter finding a measurement off quality. Not fear, not panic, practical recalibration. Her jaw is set. One dark eye through the visor crack. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot of the shaft junction. Reeves is already moving, kit stowed, scanner dark. Savitha's copper red, in my opinion. Form follows immediately behind. Plus, the shaft ahead of them extends toward a transit corridor access. The red alert light bleeds through every seam and gap in the shaft walls, giving the narrow space an ominous, warm red cast. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Interior transit corridor of the Scarab reclamation vessel, seen from the shaft access panel. A long, wide corridor lit by blue-white functional lighting with red alert indicators now flashing at intervals. Scarab script on every wall panel, and the corridor is empty of enforcement units for this moment. A gap in the patrol rotation. The corridor stretches far in both directions. Reeves is basically visible at the panel edge, assessing. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Action shot. Reeves and Savith moving through the transit corridor. Reeves close to the wall, Savith immediately behind, both moving with careful speed. Ahead, the first Scarab enforcement units at a processing station focused on intake verification of a group of colonists. The enforcement unit's attention is on the documents. I think, two figures are in the unit's peripheral range. The corridor, honestly, blue-white light and red alert light mix. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, basically dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the Scarab enforcement unit performing intake verification. Its forelimbs are occupied with document processing, optical sensors directed downward at the intake forms. Its carapace reflects the blue-white lighting, which its shock prod is holstered. The documents it processes are angular Scarab format, efficient, unornamented. And I think the periphery of its optical range, a motion blur, suggests Reeves and Savith passing. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Tight shot. Reeves actually and Savith slipping through the enforcement unit's attention window. Reeves watching the unit over her shoulder, timing it. The unit's optical sensors are still on the intake forms. Savitha's copper-red chromatophores are barely contained. Some awareness that the coloration itself is a risk in such bright lighting. She moves quickly through the gap. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Interior of a secondary storage passage branching off the main transit corridor. Narrow, lined with Scarab preservation containers sealed in angular gray composite. The air has a chemical quality, a sharp, organic solvent smell suggested by both figures' body language. Reeves basically consults the scanner for 2 seconds, finds a route, stows it. Savith follows, her larger form just fitting the passage width. The red alert light bleeds dimly through a ceiling grate. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot. Savith in the secondary passage, her chemical sensors clearly registering the preservation. Fluid smell. Her jawline is tightened, heat pit organs partially contracted against the chemical input. Reeves, ahead of her, appears entirely unaffected, moving through the smell without acknowledgement. The contrast between their reactions to the same stimulus is visible. Cinematic sci-fi, I guess, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot of the end of the secondary passage. Ahead, the main transit corridor is visible. 40 meters of open corridor, blue-white, and red alert light. The third Scareth enforcement unit's visible at the far end between them and the airlock. It is active, scanning. The airlock frame is visible behind it. The distance is exact and unambiguous. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves at the passage exit. She's looking at the enforcement unit, then at the corridor, then at the airlock. Her expression is the carpenter with the wrong measurement again. Her hand goes to the kit belt, pauses. Then she straightens. Her posture changes from evasion to something else. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide action shot. Reeves steps out into the 40-meter corridor and walks toward the enforcement unit. Not, I think, sneaking, not running. To be fair, walking. The specific look, weight, and direction of someone authorized to be there. The corridor's blue-white and red alert light illuminate her patched armor in full. Behind her, basically, Savith is frozen at the passage exit, copper-red chromatophores visible. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the Scareth enforcement unit's optical array activating fully. Scanning range extending toward Reeves. The array's 4 optical components rotate to a forward-facing position. The enforcement unit produces the standard challenge tone, suggested by a sound wave graphic at the corner of the frame. Its shot prod is no longer holstered. The kind of corridor light reflects in its dark compound lenses. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot. Reeves stops in the corridor, turns toward the enforcement unit, and reaches into the kit at her belt. She produces printed documentation, actual paper, a physical document. Her posture is that of someone presenting routine credentials. The enforcement unit's optical array is fully oriented on her. The distance between them is 10 meters, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the documentation in Reeves's hand. A printed form with a hegemonic review board header visible at the top, dense text below. The paper is real, weight, texture, the slight curl of a document folded and unfolded. The enforcement unit's scan array is attempting to read it. The ambient light shifts between blue-white and red alert. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot. Reeves turns slightly, a position adjustment, and for one fraction of a second her visor is oriented back down the corridor toward the passage exit where Savith is frozen. Through the visor crack, one dark eye. The message is direct and urgent. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Action shot. Savith explodes out of the passage exit and runs, moving low, fast, her serpentine lower body extending fully in a running coil that covers ground with surprising speed. The corridor behind her is empty. Ahead, Reeves is between her and the enforcement unit, the documentation still extended. The airlock is 20 meters. The enforcement unit's still focused on the paper. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Action shot at the airlock. Reeves's hands on the cycle controls, already cycling. Savith clears the airlock frame, which the inner door begins to seal. Behind the closing, basically, door, the enforcement unit's optical array has rotated toward them. It has completed its verification and determined the documentation is insufficient. The alert tone, in my opinion, has changed pitch. The inner door seals. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the airlock inner door sealing. The edge of the Scareth enforcement unit's visible through the narrowing gap as the door closes. Its shot prod extended, optical array fully oriented. The moment before the door closes completely. The door seals with a hiss. The gap goes to 0. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Interior of the docking bridge between the station and the small ship. a narrow connecting tube, gray composite walls, low functional lighting. Reeves and Savith are both in the bridge. Reeves already moving toward the ship hatch, Savith just inside, one hand against the wall. The exterior sounds of the Scarith alert system are audible as vibration. Through the bridge's transparent section, the vast pale hull of the Scarith vessel is visible. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves and the docking bridge. She exhales. Not with relief, with the specific quality of someone checking numbers that came back as expected. Her body language settles fractionally. Her left shoulder armor shows the thermal irregularity still present. Her, in my opinion, cracked visor reflects the low bridge lighting. Cinematic look, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Savith's bare wrist. The intake tag, processing unit 7204, is gone. The coupling bracket, scar from the clip, is barely visible. 3 millimeters of slightly raised scale tissue. Savith's scaled thumb presses against it. The docking bridge lighting is low and functional. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot in the docking bridge. Savith looking at her own bare wrist, her eyes fixed on the scar where the tag was. Her chromatophores are at the unnamed, anomalous color, still not cycling. Her expression is interior, turned inward. In the background, Reeves has reached the ship hatch, and it's opening. Cinematic, basically, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Interior, in my opinion, of the small ship. The hatch opens into a narrow corridor that smells of lived-in human habitation. Recycled air, food preparation residue, engine chemical trace. In my opinion, lighting is warm, not blue-white, not red alert. The specific warmth of a light source chosen rather than optimized. The corridor walls are functional gray, but humanized. A small magnetic clip with a folded piece of paper at eye height, a scuff mark on the floor at the corner. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot of the small ship cockpit. 2 crew configuration rigged for single operation. Every surface is within arm's reach of a single pilot seat. The main console has been reorganized, secondary stations folded away, controls clustered in a single functional zone. To be fair, dent in the right side of the secondary console, roughly fist-shaped, clearly not structural. A small framed image attached to the panel above the navigation array. A food wrapper tucked under one console, warm cockpit lighting. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the dent in the secondary console. The dent is on the right side, roughly fist-shaped, the metal deformed inward. The impact has been there long enough for the deformation to show oxidization at the edges. The surface around is clean. The dent is simply present, unremarked, lived with. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot of the cockpit. Reeves is in the pilot's seat, hands moving across the controls in the same automatic competence as the field kit in the shaft. The undock sequence is cycling. Amber lights on the navigation panel beginning to shift to green. Savith is in the co-pilot position, her larger form occupying more of the space than the seat was designed for. Scale plates at the unnamed color. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the navigation panel as the undock sequence completes. Lights shift from amber to green in sequence. The ship's status indicators confirm separation from the docking bridge. Through the forward viewport, the vast pale hull of the Scarith vessel is visible. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot through the cockpit viewport. The Scarith reclamation vessel ordained debt fills the frame in the immediate foreground. Vast, pale-hulled, geometric with the austerity of Scarith design. No curves, no ornamentation. Pure function on an enormous scale. Below it, the colony planet blue-gray and cloud-streaked. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the ship separating from the ordained debt's docking ring. The docking clamps releasing. The small ship, heavily patched, clearly a working vessel. Pulling away from the vast pale flank of the Scarith vessel. The scale difference is extreme. The I guess small ship is a repair history. The Scarith vessel is a statement about order. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot in the cockpit. Reeves reaching for the older battered datapad. Separate from the scanner, the material worn at the edges with heavy handling. She pulls it from its clip and scrolls. Stops. The datapad screen's light reflects on her visor. Savith watches look from the co-pilot position. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the datapad screen. An intake log open, dense text, listing field triage entries. One entry is visible with a 6-year-old timestamp. The entry look, field show, species, Shelvari, identification, diplomatic corps, triage classification, non-priority, status, treated. In the TBH, margin beside this entry, the small hand-drawn mark, a cross with 4 equal arms, and a centered point pressed deep into the digital margin, as if this entry has a different status from all the others. Cinematic honestly, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Reeves's sort of face, lit by the datapad screen glow in the dim cockpit. She's looking at the entry. Her expression has the quality of a person who has opened a drawer and found exactly what they expected to find. Not surprise, which confirmation. Her mouth is almost doing something at the corners. Cinematic honestly, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Savith's face, looking at Reeves. Her chromatophores are at the anomalous, unnamed color. Still, the bioluminescent cells caught between states. Her wide, dark eyes move from Reeves's face to the datapad and back. Her heat pit organs glow faintly. She's reading the thermal signature of Reeves's emotional state, and it has sent matching any category in her reference files. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Wide shot through the cockpit viewport. The colony planet in the lower half of the frame, seen from low orbit. The settlement grid visible as geometric lines on the surface, fields, roads, one building with an impractical deep red roof on the processing installation. The ordained debt receding in the upper frame, already smaller. The planet turns slowly. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on the settlement grid of the colony planet, visible through the cockpit viewport. Small, careful, the geometry of accumulated human decision-making over years. The water processing installation with its deep, impractical red roof is prominent. Around it, the fields are arranged in efficient but not sterile patterns. Someone chose the red. Someone painted it sort of that way. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot in the cockpit. Both figures are quiet. Reeves at the controls, the ordained debt now a pale rectangle in the viewport, the colony planet below them. The cockpit lighting is warm. The secondary console with its fist-shaped dent is visible. The small framed image above the navigation array is partially visible, but not legible. The food wrapper under the console. The datapad for what it's worth, with the marked entry clipped to the side panel. Cinematic sci-fi actually, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up on Savith's wrist, the bare wrist, the 3mm coupling scar from the removed tag. Her scaled thumb presses against the scar tissue. Her chromatophores remain at the anomalous, unnamed color. Through the viewport beyond her wrist, the colony planet turns. The light on her scales is warm from the cockpit, not the cold blue-white of the processing bay. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up like on the old battered datapad clipped to the side console. The screen at rest, the filing header of the review board case visible. In the corner, the hand-drawn mark, the cross with 4 equal arms. The material of the datapad is worn to softness at the edges, the kind of wear that takes years of daily handling to achieve. The warm cockpit light. The colony planet visible in the far background through the viewport. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Medium shot of Savith in the co-pilot's seat. She has sent looking at the datapad or at Reeves. She's pretty much looking at the viewport where the colony planet turns. Her form is large in the small seat, her serpentine lower body coiled beneath her. Her scale plates catch the warm cockpit light. Her chromatophores are still at the unnamed color, not cycling, not reverting to standard palette, still between states. A creature whose category system has encountered its first permanent gap. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A final wide shot through the cockpit viewport. The small, patched ship moving away from the receding ordained debt and toward open space. The colony planet in the lower frame, turning slowly. Stars ahead. The Scarith vessel, sort of, and the colony planet are both in the same frame. The vast machine of debt and the small, careful settlement of people trying to stay. The ship moves away from one and toward the other. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. I guess quiet interior, two-shot final. Reeves at the pilot controls, the ordained debt now small in the viewport. Savith beside, in my opinion, her in the co-pilot position, looking at the planet. The cockpit's warm lit, inhabited. Neither is speaking. Plus, the small framed image above the navigation array. The food wrapper. The dent. All the small, accumulated evidence of a person who has lived in this space for a long time. Savitha's chromatophores glow at the unnamed color, faintly, steadily, like something that has found its rest state and is staying there. Cinematic sci-fi illustration. Dramatic lighting, deep space setting.